In it here now, I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna bid on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Appreciate you joining us on this Saturday. We're recording at the Pfeiffer's WNX Radio recording studio. And again, this is going to be part number 2, where Danielle Drotzmann has WNX personality is joining us. Danielle does a lot of the market reports for the radio station here. And last week we had a really great conversation about the comparison of current day commodity and livestock markets versus markets back in the turn of the century in the early 1900s, actually the week of Christmas in 1924. And we had a great conversation, right,
yes,
Danielle?
It was a great one, yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. The marriage is still treating you great, and everything's going good. You're madly in love still.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
It's great.
Because we're on the radio, when we talk about Danielle and you talk about her husband, you could just tell that her eyes get those great big puppy dog eyes and all happy, and she's over there smiling, and it's wonderful when young people get married, and it's a great place to be in life. But in doing the recording last week and talking about the commodity and market reports, it inspired a lot of conversation and a lot of thinking about the history and where these market reports came from. Mm-hmm. And as we were talking this morning, getting ready for the radio show, we talked a little bit about the history of the transportation of livestock and commodities into some of these marketplaces. And you got to remember that back 100 years ago, when did they start doing market reports, Danielle?
Around like 1921. So, they probably had like other things, like, you take your cattle to the local sale barn and they would, stuff, but actual like market reports started around 1921.
1921. I did a little bit of research too, and I didn't see any market reports that really predated it back into the 19-teens is what I would say. But you're exactly right. Those commodity markets and those livestock market reports really started to be reportable in the early 1920s. How valuable was that to producers and to people all over the country, to agriculture?
Yeah, very valuable. You, even now, you can look at other sale barns and see what cattle are bringing there in different parts of the country. So even back then, same thing, probably. You could see what this 500-pound steer was bringing versus what it's bringing in your area, so you can kind of... And then it all starts affecting each other and and all that good stuff. So
it's absolutely crazy. And a lot of times in the early 1900s, education was starting to become very important. Mm-hmm. And so journalism and the ability to print and printing presses were being greatly advanced, and the ability to communicate was being greatly advanced. Look at the history of WNX radio that was over 100 years ago. Is in this area, you could buy an AM radio, hence the founding of WNX radio, but there was no AM radio stations to broadcast on an AM radio station, and that was one of the reasons why the Gurney family started WNX radio, was simply to broadcast market reports and commodity reports. But there was also something else that was really interesting, and one of the first radio shows that we recorded on the Legacy of Agriculture was talking about the invention of barbed wire in the 1800s, and then the mass production of barbed wire through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. But one of the big challenges that was starting to happen to agricultural producers was as the ability to get livestock and commodities to market. And you did a little bit of research on on the transportation and how that started to evolve at the turn of the century. Tell us just a little bit about that, Danielle.
Yeah, so I mean, back in the day, the big way to transport cattle from place to place was cattle drives. So, I mean, you had cowboys or whoever, driving your cattle across the range, getting them from one place to the other. But as soon as the railroads, which I think is kind of interesting, start making their way across the terrain, all of a sudden you have refrigerated cars. You have, just a more efficient way to get cattle from place to place, fewer death loss, everything like that. So it's definitely revolutionized transport of cattle and livestock in general, and probably even commodities like grain and stuff too. So
yep, and right after the Civil War, and as people were, the government was giving people sections of land out in Kansas and Oklahoma and the Panhandle of Texas just to get them out and to get agriculture started in the lower part of the Midwest. In that barbed wire report, we talked a lot about all of a sudden you have barbed wire. So when you received a half section or a section of land, you have 640 acres and you're able to fence it and not only keep your own livestock in the confines of that 640 acres, but keep all the neighbors' cattle out. But one of the great big problems that happened as a result of that is okay, I'm granted 640 acres in Guyman, Oklahoma, and it's the only water hole or the only spring in a very large area. And all of a sudden, these cattle barons that are herding thousands of head of cattle out of, say, southeastern Colorado, and they're going to Kansas City or to Omaha, and I fenced off the water hole. That creates a big problem when you're moving cattle across country like that. So the railroads actually became very important to the transportation of the cattle for just what you said, because something just as simple as death loss, you move 1,000 head of cattle across Oklahoma or Kansas or any of those hot, dry, dusty states, it would probably take weeks in order to do that versus putting them on rail, which would probably take days. And I'm sure that presented its own challenges. But what did you learn about the railroad?
Just that it really revolutionized the transportation, because I mean, now you don't have to those cattle don't have to be alive. As soon as refrigeration and stuff was developed, they don't have to be alive to transport across whatever, and even that probably even turned into shipping across seas and stuff too. So basically, just the fact that it really revolutionized what people do, and can do things in a lot quicker of time. You probably don't need as many people to do things, and even like when you mentioned the barbed wire situation, like you have to what am I trying to say? It takes less people to watch cattle and stuff. And
that's right. Yeah.
Less labor, and so that's pretty much what I took away from it.
Yep. No, you're exactly right. And the transportation of not only cattle but the transportation of commodities as well. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our first segment on the legacy of agriculture. We're recording right here in the Pfeiffer's WNX radio studio in Yankton, South Dakota. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. A brisk conversation with Danielle Drotzmann. I got your name right this time. There you go. I'm doing much better with that. Last time I butchered it, but I found out that I had written it down wrong.
Yeah.
And so I was reading it wrong. Well, folks, we'll be right back.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Hey folks, it's Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm back with Danielle Drotzmann, who is a WNAX personality that does all of the market reports. We're into our second segment, and our second show talking about cattle, talking about the transportation of livestock, market reports, as well as commodities and commodity reports. And I will tell you that from the 1800s into the 1900s, a huge challenge, particularly in the livestock industry, was getting large herds of marketable animals from one part of the country to the other. And so in the late 1800s and early 1900s, oftentimes it was just by cattle drives, and that's all there was to it. Yep. You drove your cattle from a ranch that might have been in the eastern part of a particular state, and you drove them all the way across to the other side of the state. The death loss was often horrendous, and the other thing that they ran into a lot of was as people stealing cattle. Mm-hmm. You get a herd of cattle, say 1,000 head of calves or 500 head of calves, that you're driving from one part of the state to the other, and you get 2/3 away across the state, and somebody was there to help themselves to your calves or help themselves to your cattle. And so it became a real problem. And the railroad system, as railroads were being developed and as they were becoming more efficient, was an important part of marketing. It was an important part of getting those animals from one part to the other. But it presented a lot of challenges because back in the day, railroads were very crude. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes the power units or the engines on rail were very crude. The rail cars were very crude. And you put a number of cars together that are loaded with cattle. Oftentimes these were very rank. They were very wild animals. They were not used to being penned in, and all of a sudden you start moving them. There's a lot of problems, and there's a lot of things that could go on inside of a rail car that those animals just weren't used to. And so the other challenge that you had, which is transporting by rail, was getting enough feed and water to them to keep them healthy and to keep them comfortable and keep them happy. I mean, an animal is just like a human being. They want to eat, they want to be able to drink, and they want to be comfortable. And a lot of times transporting them via rail that way was not a comfortable way for that animal to travel. So as the development and as railroads increased and they started building enclosed rail cars, they discovered that when an animal was fat and it was ready to be processed, that if they took it down to a slaughterhouse, they could process that animal and do what they call swinging beef. Now, those of you that are in the livestock industry understand what swinging meat is, or an animal that swings. But the challenge was, particularly in the summertime, is if we didn't want to ship a live fat animal from the Midwest to the East Coast, which was where the majority of the market was, where the consumers were consuming large amounts of protein, it became very important and a much easier way to transport animals swinging. But the challenge was in the summer months and in the fall months and late spring, how do you keep that meat cool enough that it doesn't spoil? So particularly in the northern states in North Dakota and Minnesota and some of those very, very cold states, in the wintertime, crews would go out onto the Missouri River or some of the other larger rivers, and they would cut big blocks of ice out of the river, put them on wagons or on in the early 1900s, trucks were becoming developed enough that they could move those great big blocks of ice into usually a side hill, and they would dig a side hill out. They would fill that side hole up partially with straw and then wrap straw around those blocks of ice and then cover it back up with dirt. And that ice would stay frozen usually pretty late into the summertime. And when an allotment of cattle was ready to be shipped swinging, they would take those blocks of ice out of the side hill. They'd they'd pack the car with as much ice as they possibly could, and it created enough cool inside of that boxcar that as that meat was being transported across the United States and it was usually the very, very good beef that they were doing this with, the boxcar would stay cool enough to get it to the East Coast to finish processing that carcass and be able to distribute that carcass eventually to the end user. The challenge that they had with the railroad was the railroad was very undependable. Oftentimes there was mechanical problems with the train cars or an engine, or you would get into Chicago or some of the bigger hubs going back east, and a train would end up being delayed by a day or 2 or 3, and usually the ice calculations melting would the ice would just simply not last long enough to get to the marketplace, say in New York City, and that beef would spoil in the boxcar. And so when the meat arrived back east, the meat would be spoiled and would not be usable at all. So it definitely created a lot of challenge in transporting swinging animals from one end of the country to the other. But eventually refrigeration came along. The advancement of the internal combustion engine and the development of refrigeration for rail completely changed the face of it. And then it got much better when highway systems were developed, and it became much easier to get a product to the end user once trucks became refrigerated, and that process came along. And so there was a lot that was going on in what we're calling the marketing of livestock, and really commodities were a lot the same way. Of course, wheat or oats or any commodity doesn't have to be refrigerated, obviously, but getting commodities from say western South Dakota or Nebraska to a mill, where it could be processed into cereals or rolled into oats or made into some type of food, was also a major challenge. And so as railroads became more advanced, and they invented rail cars that would hopper bottom style rail cars that could haul those commodities, it started to change drastically for agriculture, and became very good for agriculture, but very expensive too. And as you and I talked about last week, Danielle, is that especially if you're very, very rural and very remote, the cost of transporting your commodities from one spot to the other becomes very, very expensive. And so it affects markets, right?
It does.
It affects the value of your commodity on that farm, and often offsets cheaper land, or often offset being able to raise a less expensive crop in a more rural area. Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree. I mean, I guess when I was doing a little bit of my research for this, I found that the railroads have been used since the 1830s to transport stuff across. And so I'm sure they've been using that for grain and everything like that, which as things start moving across the country faster, it creates a bigger demand, makes price go up. And then people start flocking to, your cities like Chicago, your St. Paul, all those big cities that have access to that rail, because there's, an access to food, access to the processing plants that can make it good. And even, I guess when you brought that up, what popped into my mind is like an acre of land around here versus an acre of land out in like your pasture land. Obviously, this land here may be a little bit more valuable because you can grow your crops and corn and you can make money off of it, but out there it's a little bit cheaper just because I would say it's less attainable, less water, less, all that fun stuff. So yeah, that's what popped into my head when you said that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. And so it's very interesting. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our second segment of the Legacy of Agricultural. Danielle and I will be right back.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffers. Nobody does it better.
Folks, we're back. I'm Chris Bair, your host of The Legacy of Agriculture. Appreciate you joining us on this Saturday morning at the Pfeiffer's WNX recording studio in Yankton, South Dakota. I want to give our shout out to Pfeiffer Auction and Realty for being the sponsor of The Legacy of Agriculture throughout our first year. We're coming into harvest time, right, Danielle? Mm-hmm. And we definitely want to wish our farmers a safe and a happy harvest. I know in this area that silage harvest has been going on for quite a while, and we're now starting to hear of a few guys that are wanting to get into the beans and some of the early corn, or wet corn as they call it here in the Midwest. So we always want to wish our farmers a happy and safe harvest. And we're talking about markets and what's affected markets back in the day, a century ago. Mm-hmm. So you've are very familiar with the markets today. So tell us a little bit about markets today and how they're affected and what you learned from that.
Yeah, so obviously a year ago when I started here, wasn't really too in tune with, I guess, what was happening with markets, but I've learned a lot over the past year. And so honestly, like, it's crazy. That's just what I can say about what I've learned so far, is how much goes into what price you see on the board. You don't really, feel like you don't really realize it when you just are out there and you look from the outside looking in, but from the inside looking out, it's kind of crazy. So everything from, I guess, what do we want to start with? You want to start with livestock or grain?
Let's start with, we've been talking about livestock, so let's start with commodities, and then we'll go to livestock.
Okay, sounds good. So grain side of things, obviously we're moving into the harvest season, so a lot of times they're talking about drought right now. So, I mean, how fast your corn's going to dry out, how fast your beans are going to dry out. And like the harvest, there's a lot of reports out right now that's saying this year we're going to have a really big corn crop. We're going to have a really big bean crop because we actually got a little bit of rain this year. So,
not just a little bit, but 24 inches south of Sioux Falls in 36 hours that created all the flooding. Is just a little bit of rain.
Yeah, it is.
24 inches.
Yeah. So we got rain. So we are expecting a big corn crop, big bean crop. So a lot of the yield estimates that they're coming out through the USDA have a lot to do with what the market price is right now for those two categories, I would say. So yeah, the expected yields will affect prices, the actual yields once we start getting into harvest. Another thing I find really interesting on the commodity side is how much other countries will affect the price too. So like if Brazil is having a dry year, or if Brazil's having a wet year, it'll affect prices here. Or even on the wheat side, I think just yesterday, wheat was down like double digits, 15, 20 cents or something like that. And the analyst I had on yesterday was like, oh yeah, like in Russia, Putin was threatening nuclear war on Ukraine, or, something like that. So the wheat was going crazy, and then he calmed down. So now it's down 15 cents. So I just think stuff like that is crazy, how it can affect it so much. Speaking
of crazy, Putin's not crazy or anything, is he?
No.
Jeez. Talk about a dictator.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember that actually, Danielle. I remember that as a kid. I remember that's one of the things that greatly damaged the wheat market in the United States in the late 70s was a grain embargo against Russia. Mm-hmm. And it completely shut down the wheat markets and affected agriculture greatly for a lot of years. It took a long time for the wheat market and agriculture to recover in the early 80s from something as simple as a wheat embargo. And we all know, and we've all been told, that if you control a country's food supply, you control the country, right? And the whole idea behind that is there was a lot of political problems going on, and the United States got the great big idea that if they shut off wheat, that it would help that situation. But what it did is, in turn, in the United States, really hurt agriculture during that wheat embargo. And I know I've got a lot of 60-year-old and 70-year-old and 80-year-old agriculturist producers out there going, yeah, that's exactly right. So,
yeah.
But anyways, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And even and especially sometimes, there's a little bit less news going on, especially with the markets. And so even things as simple as weather, like if we're going to get rain today, markets might be down a little bit or might be up a little bit. Cheap livestock, cheap, expensive grain. They feed off of each other too. Yep. So we have expensive livestock right now and we have cheap grain. So yep. I just think that's kind of another thing that affects things and can play roles. And it's very interesting to watch. So.
Oftentimes, and you brought up a great point there, is as somebody who is running or managing a feedlot that's trying to feed cattle, reasonably priced. I don't want to use the word cheap. I don't like that word very well. But a lower corn market and lower commodity markets, barley, particularly corn, alfalfa, helps to raise beef and finished beef, and anything that has to do with animals, anything that has to do with the protein market. Lower commodity prices help those producers in the livestock world to produce a protein that's cheaper to the consumer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I think is kind of interesting, and Keith has said this a couple times, that when you're in there reading the markets and you're, talking with your analysts and stuff, and you always think about the fact of making money. Like, you want to give the producers the information to make money.
Yes.
I guess it's hard for me to think about it but you want to think about the people that are also in the market to buy too. So the corn might be down today, but that might be good for this person because he wants to buy corn, but it might not be good for this person because he wants to sell corn. So correct. I think that keeping that in mind too, when you hear the markets, buying and selling, you got to tailor to both audiences that want to do both. So
there's oftentimes a very delicate balance between too much and too little, and everything has an equal and opposite reaction. It's very interesting with supply and demand, how that affects it, and how one bad report can greatly affect a market or swing a market for 24 or 48 hours or over the weekend. And so sometimes it almost seems like the marketplace is delicate, right?
It's very delicate, yeah.
So,
even...
Hey, Danielle, we're going to be right back. We're at the end of our third segment, and we're going to be right back.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffers. Nobody does it better.
Folks, we're back. I'm your host, Chris Bair, with the Legacy of Agriculture, back with Danielle Drotzmann from WNX Radio, a radio personality giving market reports and actually very knowledgeable in the markets and in receiving and broadcasting market reports. And we appreciate Danielle for joining us and being a part of our radio show. So we were talking an awful lot about livestock and the effects of livestock. How about commodities? Tell us about commodities.
like the girl, like the
Did I
grain.
get that backwards?
Yeah, you did.
I did. I did get it backwards.
It was like,
You
what are we
know,
just talking about?
sometimes I just need to get up on the other side of the bed and I would do a lot better. So I'm going to let you lead and I'll follow. How's that, Danielle?
Sounds good.
All right. You do it and I'll listen for once.
Okay, so we just got done talking about commodities. So how about let's talk about livestock? Sound good?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yep, you're exactly right.
Okay, so yeah, I mean the livestock side is very similar to grains, but different at the same time. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that as well. Some of the big things. One thing I guess I could point out is actually the week I was on vacation, I got back and the cattle market dropped like $7 in one day. And there was a report of an anthrax out in like Wyoming area. And so there was a good herd of cattle that died. And so that dropped the market like $7. So disease is one thing that is really influential on our prices and whatever prices in markets today. I guess another thing would be, I mentioned before, cheap corn, cheap beans for hogs and corn for cattle. So that plays a factor in the prices of cattle here today. And weights is another interesting thing too. The heavier your cattle, the cheaper they be, or the more you'll get for them. So just a couple things there that will affect markets, I guess.
Oftentimes you would think it would be just the opposite. An animal gets heavier, the cheaper it is, the lighter it is, the more expensive it is. I've actually never quite understood why the market does that.
Yeah, I guess the best way I can understand is you have opportunity to grow the cow or grow the feeder or whatever you're buying the way you want to. So
Okay. Yeah, sure.
a lot of times people will pay less for something that's implanted and more for something that's not.
Okay.
That's just what I've heard from my auctioneer husband. Just because, with implants, I guess there's so many ways you can mess it up. So if they're not implanted, you know for sure that you're going to be able to grow that steer, heifer, whatever it is, the way you want it to be done. So
explain implants to our listeners.
Yeah, so I guess an implant, a lot of times, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. There's ones right off of weaning. There's ones for growing. There's ones specifically for heifers. There's ones specifically for steers. Basically, it's a hormone. A lot of times they'll put it in the ear under the skin, and it releases hormones basically to improve your rate of gain. So, yeah. That's the best I can explain it.
That's the way that it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, an implant helps in the growth of that animal and get that animal to market faster. And yeah, very important to a lot of feeders, and everybody has their own what I would quote unquote recipe for getting a calf from the time it hits the ground and it's born until the time that it's finished, usually in a feedlot. So there's a lot that goes on there in a very, really kind of in a very short period of time. Is about 18 months, doesn't it take to get a calf from when it's born until it's ready to go and to be processed. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff. So what does your crystal ball tell you that commodities are going to do for the rest of 2024 and into 2025? Now, you said it's all about making money. So what you say, Danielle, is going to affect all of agriculture in the United States.
Yeah, probably. And I'm probably going to say something and it's going to be completely wrong. And then I'm going to hear about it later from all my neighbors or something. Yeah.
They're going to toilet paper your house is what they're going to do, right?
Yeah, probably. I guess on the grain side, I don't know. I think just from the talk, they're expecting like a big crop. So I think it's either going to stay about what it is or it's going to drop. But I could be completely wrong.
It's really, really tough to tell.
Yeah.
And really until we get down to the end of the year and we know what's in the bin, and until harvest is over the next 60 days, it's really difficult to tell what that marketplace is going to do. Crops in the bin is really what tells the truth and the entirety of the story for 2024 when it comes to crops. But this is what I think. There's been a tremendous amount of ebb and flow in the marketplace over the last 4 or 5 years. We have seen historic highs. And agriculture has done very well over the last few years as a result of strong commodity prices. And now we're seeing a normalization. I often tell my friends in the equipment world, and I realize that we're not talking about equipment right now. There's been a lot of chatter out there about machinery values and the machinery values, particularly in that first and second generation trade, that those values have dropped a lot. And I always say, what an opportunity to go out and be able to buy late model equipment at a price that is by far more reasonable than it was a couple of years ago. So go buy some equipment now, because what goes down has to come back up. We know that it will always normalize. And we also know from our radio show last week is, as if you remember right, Danielle, we were talking about, I think it was barley. I'm not sure if it was barley or oats that was like back in 1924 is worth 77 cents a hundred. And now it's worth $4 or $5. And I think we kind of decided that as a rule of thumb, when it came to commodities, that commodities over a 10-year period of time usually increase on the average about 10%. And so, but the last 5 years have proved to be totally unorthodox. But as a rule of thumb, they increase in value as inflation increases and as things change and the demand changes. And we know that everybody wants to eat every day. And so there'll always be a place for agriculture. There'll always be a place for people like you and I. And there'll always be a place for a farmer and a rancher, which is to me is the lifeblood of the United States, and it's the lifeblood of our country, is those that are producing. Folks, we're down to the end of our part number 2 with Danielle Drotzmann from WNX Radio. She does all the market reports. Danielle, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you. We listened to you on the radio, and for being a radio personality for just over a year, we think you're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And so we hope that we can shake hands at the Pfeiffer's radio station, Pfeiffer's recording studio, I should say, many, many times. And thank you for joining us. For a complete listing of all of the Pfeiffer's auction, you'll want to visit our website at pfeifers.com or give us a call at the Southern Pfeiffer's auction facility just south of Sioux Falls at 605-836-2277. Nobody does it better.
In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605-836-2277.